Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. My goal is what we've discussed today will be immediately actionable and useful to you, and I'd love to hear your comments for this episode about what you're planning on implementing. Today, I'm very privileged to be once again joined by Dr. Michael Roberto, who is the Trustee Professor of Management at Bryant University. He joined the tenure faculty at Bryant after serving 6 years on the faculty of Harvard Business School. His research focuses on decision-making, which is going to be the topic of today's program, teamwork and leadership. He has published 3 books, the latest of which is titled Unlocking Creativity. Other ones are Why Great Leaders Don't Take Yes for an Answer, which is going to be the topic and the focus of today's program, and Know What You Don't Know. He has also developed 3 great course lecture series and a best-selling Everest leadership case study. Welcome to the program again, Mike.
Thanks, Charles. Good to be with you.
So today, like I said, the topic's going to be around decision-making, and you provide a lot in your case studies, in your books, in your programs, a lot of relevant historical examples of when decision-making failed, which begs the question, why do we look for decision-making in order to improve that piece?
I think that one of the dangers I realized going all the way back to the 90s when I was an MBA student and doing hundreds and hundreds of case studies is that there's a bias to success in terms of the case studies that are typically taught, right? So, back in the 90s, it was G and Microsoft. Nowadays, it's a million cases about all the usual characters, right? That we're looking at, Tesla, Google, et cetera. And so there's a lack of really digging in and doing enough autopsies on failures. And I think that it's not that we learn more from failure than success. That's actually not correct, right? The science says actually what we learn best from is being able to compare and contrast success and failure. And so that's where I set out to start writing cases and doing research on failures. I felt like I needed to have a counterbalance, to all the success we read about. And oh, by the way, it's important to do that because a lot of the companies that are successful today, fast forward, will they still be successful 10 years from now? History says many of them will not be, right? That it's hard to stay on top. So that's what got me interested in the failures. And then once I get into them, I realized there's just powerful lessons from trying to understand why smart people, capable people, make flawed choices. And there's some real insight there that can help us all avoid those same mistakes, hopefully.
I agree with you. And I know that we look at these hoping to learn from others' mistakes, right? So that we don't repeat them. But many times leaders find it difficult to draw the appropriate lessons from these failures. Because many times, from my personal experience and what I've witnessed with other leaders, is that it's not based off your mental horsepower that distinguishes a success or a failure. It comes more to strategic decision-making in complex organizations and understanding all those nuances and other factors that are not really based off of your intellect or the processes by which you use to make those decisions. So I'd love for you to kind of go into a little bit more about strategic decision-making, what you mean by that, and unpack it a little for our audience.
Sure. So when I say strategic decision-making, I mean, choices that have high stakes, that have a fair amount of ambiguity, where the information is not at all clear, the evidence is not clear, where there's risk to the organization, right? And so we think about decisions that have a meaningful impact on the direction of the organization, of the firm. And yeah, I think one of the myths is, we think about it as well, we talk about whether it's political leaders or we talk about CEOs, like that person is really smart or that person is really dumb. Well, the bottom line is a lot of quote unquote smart people have made really flawed choices in business, in politics, in sports, and other places. It's often not about how much intellectual horsepower you have, right? It is about the fact that, well, first of all, on the cognitive side, we know that psychologists have proven to us now over decades that we're all subject to cognitive biases, decision traps like throwing good money after bad, or relying too much on data that confirms our pre-existing views. These are biases that we all have, frankly, no matter how smart we are or not, right? And then the other side is much of organizational decision-making is about politics and emotion, group dynamics, a whole bunch of factors that don't have to do with how smart one person is or not. And I think those group dynamics are a big focus of my work, right? Because I think so often the psychology of groups and the interpersonal behavior is where decisions go off the rails.
You're right. And the causes that you list for indecision making, really, you have three different categories. It's what you mentioned, the individual level, right? Those cognitive biases, and some biases are more prevalent in this process than others. The second level is that group or team dynamics and really establishing that psychological safety. And the way teams communicate is often more important than about how they interact in some ways. And then the third level you bring, which I think is also important, is that organizational level, right? If there are system rigidities in place, that's going to really inhibit a good decision from being made, because you're right, it's not about intellectual horsepower, it's about these other factors playing a role in it. And for the leader to acknowledge that and recognize that fact so they're not blind to it and are self-aware of some of these influences that are maybe hiding behind the scenes.
Yeah, no question. That third piece, as you say, I like to look at it those three levels: individual, group, and organizational. And that organizational side is about organizational systems and about culture too, right? One of the most recent cases I wrote about the Boeing 737 MAX accidents, right? Largely a story of culture shaping decision making, unfortunately, in a negative way over a number of years. And so, yes, systems and culture and system complexity shape decisions as well. And those three factors all cause those of us trying to make choices, to make flawed ones at times, even the best managers.
I agree. I'd love for you to go into that example that you talk about Alan Mulally at Ford, about how he turned that organization around really by changing the culture, and he reshaped the climate, the norms, and the decision-making processes. And I'd love for our leaders to kind of glean some insight from that great and wonderful example.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Now that you asked me about that, it's just mentioned Boeing and the 737 accidents. The interesting thing about Mulally, of course, is he was a senior executive at Boeing. For his entire career, he was at Boeing, rose to a very senior level, and left to go to Ford. I assume, I actually don't know this part, I assume he probably thought he was not going to get the CEO job at Boeing anytime soon. So he took the CEO job at Ford. What's interesting is that Boeing's culture continued to erode and become more problematic after he left. He went to a place with a problematic culture, but I think he really changed it at Ford, and he got there just before the global financial crisis, and he managed to execute a turnaround without a bankruptcy filing and without a taxpayer bailout, which was, the only one of the American automakers to pull that feat off. It was a culture of fear at Ford. And he tells this great story about, asking for weekly updates as they tried to execute their turnaround plan. And he asked the managers to all put up charts each week that were color coded, green if things were going really well, yellow if they were kind of, some issues, but not cause for alarm. And red was, we have a serious problem. And he said, we started a meeting and a few weeks went by and all the charts were green. And so he paused to stop the meeting. And so he said, I noticed all the charts are green and we're losing $18 billion. Is there anything that's not going well? And there was like nervous laughter and people just looked at their shoes, didn't know what to say. And then a few weeks later, someone was brave enough to put up a red chart and Mulally started clapping, applauding loudly. And then we stopped applauding. He asked, and he said, even that caused like a lot of nervous jitters. People were like, I think they thought that was my signal that the door was going to open and someone was going to come in and escort the executive out for having a red chart. And he said, then he asked the question of the person, is there anything we can do to help you? This really powerful question, right? Not what went wrong, not what was the cause of the problem, not how are you going to fix it or when you're going to fix it, but is there anything we do to help you? And we, not I, and other people on the team then started throwing out ideas. And pretty soon they had some help flowing the way toward this person who needed that help. And it took a little while, a few weeks before it went from green to yellow and eventually from red to yellow and eventually yellow to green. And then he said the most momentous day of the turnaround was a few weeks after that when he walked in and he said all the charts were rainbow. Because suddenly, right, it was okay to be able to say how things were really going because people realized they weren't going to get shot, right, if they did that. He started telling people, you're not red, Charles. Your issue is red, right? And I can only fix it if I know where the problems are. And really the only sin, making a mistake is not a sin. What is hiding the mistake, right? Is not getting help, seeking help, asking for help from your colleagues so you can fix it. That's the real problem. So it's a great story of recognizing that we can't make good decisions if we don't have all the information. And unfortunately, a lot of the bad information just remains hidden in organizations. People fear sharing it, or they convince themselves it's not really that bad, right? They convince themselves it's going to get better, or I can fix it, without needing help. This desire not to ask for help is often another issue that arises, he said. So to me, a really good story of a leader who understood that if we're going to make better decisions, it starts with better information. And if we don't get that flowing, it doesn't matter how great our analysis is or how smart we are. If we're not armed with the right intelligence, right information, you can't make good choices.
You're right. And he really preached the importance of problem solving rather than finger pointing. And it's okay, like you said, to admit your mistakes as long as you're learning from them and working together to fix the problem. And as a result, the climate of Ford changed, and there was a huge turnaround as a result of that culture shift within the company, which had that organizational or system rigidity in place and operating from a standpoint of perspective of fear, and a whole different culture was instituted by him, and great turnaround story.
Yeah, and not easy to do. Doesn't happen overnight, but really critical. I think we see, more and more managers coming to the realization they have to think about the environment in which decisions are made. And, I think that people are taking more care to put some work into thinking about their processes they typically use, and not just hoping. Hope is not a strategy, right? But really being more purposeful. And I think that's something I preach all the time. Be purposeful. What kind of a process do you want to put together? How do you want to bring your team together? What kind of norms do you want to create for your team? These are things you should be thinking about ahead of time and leading with some purpose on those issues. You'll put yourself in a much better position to make good choices if you do that as a leader.
I agree with you completely. And I'd like to go into kind of the decision-making process, because it could be broken up into two main pieces, right? Decision quality, and what many people don't probably realize is implementation effectiveness. And you can't have one without the other to have a sound decision-making process. So if you could just unpack those two for us and maybe give some insight into how to develop, especially that implementation effectiveness in a leader's decision-making process.
Yeah, I think that the thing is that why this is so difficult is that the thing that's going to help drive decision quality often sort of seems at odds with what's going to be needed to implement effectively, right? So what we know is that some level of constructive conflict and debate is actually crucial to decision quality, right? You want divergent thinking, right? And the clash of ideas is important, right? The testing of assumptions. The problem, of course, is once you get that, now how do you get people aligned, right, and committed? And how do you build a consensus to then pave the way to successful implementation? In other words, how do you then converge, right? And I think that's something that a lot of managers struggle with. Either they don't diverge enough in the beginning, right? They get too quickly to, one idea, groupthink in the extreme, or they diverge, they have plenty of debate, but now they've got an impasse and they've got sort of entrenched camps on their management team, and they can't get them kind of aligned to then work together once a decision has been made. How do you get people behind it, right? And so at Amazon, they sort of borrowed an old phrase from Andy Grove at Intel that says sort of disagree and commit. And I've now run into a lot of firms who borrowed this language that I think came from Intel originally. I don't know if Grove borrowed it from someone else, but I know he used it many years ago, which says, yes, we need to diverge. But at some point, the leader is going to make a call if there's not a clear consensus. And at that point, people have to get behind it, right? They've been given the opportunity. They've been given voice. They've been listened to. If you genuinely have listened, right? If you haven't just run what, my friend Mike Watkins calls the charade of consultation, right? Where you're not really listening. But if you really have listened and you've weighed the different views, at some point, the leader's got to break the tie, right? If there's no clear thing. And at that point, people have to get behind it. That's tricky. And I think that's the reason decision quality and implementation don't always go together, right? Because they sometimes work at cross purposes.
You're right. And talking about that brings to mind consensus, right? Because like you said, at some point, the leader has to make the decision. And can you kind of unpack your definition of consensus, which I love, because many people think it's just unanimity of agreement, where everyone's on the same page we're moving forward confidently into the future and we all agree, but that's not necessarily the case.
No, in fact, I would argue if you're pushing too hard for unanimity, it actually leads to some really dysfunctional behavior, right? It can cause minority views, dissenting views to get trampled on. It can cause people to get marginalized. It can cause you to overlook key risks because feel like you have so much pressure to get unanimity. No, I borrow from some great research by Stephen Floyd and Bill Woodridge from years ago, where they say, really the way we ought to think about consensus is the combination of commitment. People are committed to work together in the implementation, right? And strong shared understanding, meaning we actually understand the rationale, what we're doing. So, because sometimes leaders will make choices and not clearly articulate what the rationale, what their thinking was of why they chose option B instead of option C. And that's really important that you articulate that well and people understand what were the criteria you used for making that choice. What was your thinking? Because then they have to be able to go out and tell their own people, you know what? This is why Charles wants us to move in this direction, right? If you don't know, how can you possibly inform your own people, right? And so it's commitment and understanding. If you have those two, that's what we're looking for. Not unanimity, but commitment and understanding. If we have those two, we can implement together effectively.
I love that distinction. Let's move to, because I think this is more of a problem than the other extreme, meaning not enough corporations are getting enough dissent. So let's talk about two techniques that you mentioned in the book that are great for encouraging this kind of dissent so that it happens in a productive way. One is dialectical inquiry. The other is the devil's advocacy. But let's first talk about if you could unpack the dialectical inquiry method for us, for our listeners, so they can use that as a tool as well.
Sure. I mean, it sounds like this fancy name. You might use point counterpoint, but the idea is that you take your team and you ask them to split into two or more subgroups, right? And to develop sort of alternatives and then to sort of critique and debate each other's alternatives, right? And so that could be a really nice mechanism. By using the subgroups, you're not making one person stand up in the team and say, I've got a different idea. That can be a lonely, kind of very risky, interpersonal kind of thing, as opposed to say, I want the three of you to develop an option. I want the three of you to develop an alternative option, alternative plan. And then let's swap them and critique them and the like. That can be a really effective method. The other devil's advocacy is to ask a group, not necessarily to come up with a competing alternative, but to really be able to look for flaws, ask questions, offer a constructive critique, et cetera. And these two mechanisms what they're really doing is sort of institutionalizing debate, right? Or dissent in a way. They're not, instead of hoping that someone will be brave enough to jump in the meeting and say, hey, Charles, I think we should look at this differently. We're sort of forcing some level of critical thinking into the process by using these methods. We're also making it so people go, oh, okay. So, Charles isn't doing this because he's being a pain. Charles is doing this because he's been asked by the leader to take on this technique as a means of helping us get to a better decision. So it takes some of the personal pressure off when people know, oh, the leader has chosen a method to help us and asked one or more people to play a role to help do this.
Would you encourage that person to be different each time that decision happens? Because there's another technique, De Bono's thinking hats, right? Where you look at a problem from different perspectives and it really gives you a more holistic view of the problem, right? But they also encourage people to change that role and perspective. So each individual within the team also sees it from different angles as well.
Yeah, I'm a big believer. I think the other reason, besides getting people to look at things from different perspectives, is that if the same person, for example, is always your devil's advocate, they become a broken record. People say, all right, here we go. Charles is, in Charles's view, it's raining every day. It's always cloud covered, there's never any sunshine, and they just stop listening to Charles at that point, right? Or, frankly, they start to ostracize or marginalize Charles at that point, right? So this is the danger. So I think it does have to. And, there's a great interview in the New York Times a couple of years ago, a very successful healthcare CEO named Kevin Lofton, who said that, he likes to ask someone to play the role of devil's advocate, but he purposely rotates the role within the team. And I think that's a really astute strategy.
Another strategies that you advocate for using devil's advocate, or the other one, is right? Trying to defer judgment in the early stages so that people don't feel like they're being attacked. This is a role they're playing. So to defer that judgment and then ask questions rather than promoting a preferred solution. Just keep asking questions to brainstorm, to get those ideas out before you start using that critiquing mechanism of the decision-making process and whittling it down. But just having that open atmosphere where there's some transparency, but also a lack of judgment.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of holding off on, I'm a big believer in constructive conflict, but I think the timing of it really matters. And if you just unleash criticism and debate too early before we fleshed out some options, that the problem is like, okay, Mike put an idea out there, it gets riddled, by people. It's not just that I become defensive, right? It's that now other people around the table go, well, I'm not putting my idea out there. Look what just happened to Mike's idea, right? So I think I'm a big advocate of saying, look, I'm a big believer in the value of dialogue, dissent, and debate. But I think early on when we're attacking the problem, first, we got to really understand the nature of the problem before we jump to solutions. And then secondly, we got to develop some options before we start criticizing those options. And I think giving people sort of a safe space to put the options out there, even if they're a little outlandish, even if they might not sound feasible, let's just get some out there. And then once we've, got a set that we think is a workable set of alternatives, now we can begin to apply some techniques to apply some critical thinking and, let's sharpen them, if you will. But taking the knives out too quickly is really dangerous, I think.
And this is great because in the book too, you mentioned Jack Welch, and he really stressed the fact that you got to manage in reality, that you got to face reality, see the world as it is, not the way you wish it were. And these types of techniques really help to develop that holistic viewpoint about these problems. Do you see this happen quite a bit with companies these days where you got a lot of yes people, not enough dissent, or has it moved more in the other direction to now where you're trying to get consensus around so many differing and disparate views?
I think when I wrote the first edition of the Why Great Leaders book, that was 17 years ago. I think the problem was rampant at the time of people really not having enough debate, and really people often fearful of offering a dissenting view. I think we made some progress in that regard. It feels like we have. I think a lot more companies are talking about this as an issue. I think a lot more leaders have become aware that they can be a really dominant force in the room and they can often silence people without even intending to. But there's still a lot of organizations that struggle with this, right? And of course, some particularly are vulnerable, right? Some where you've had a very successful leader in place for a long time, it just becomes very hard. People start just going, well, that Reed Hastings at Netflix talked about this at one point, saying when they made the quick stir decision, which was such a fiasco, he's like, I learned afterward there were these people who had real concerns. And he goes, and it wasn't so much because that they felt like I had been somebody who had quashed dissent numerous times, but it was an issue of like, I was, the founder of the company. I'd been really successful. I'd been there a long time and people just stopped questioning you at that point, right? You've been on a winning streak. So they just defer. And he goes, it's dangerous, right? Because nobody's on a winning streak forever, right? And so I do think even today, as we've made some progress, but companies that particularly got to watch out are the ones where you've had a CEO who stays for a long time. There's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But, Bob Iger, when he retired at Disney, he wrote a book, a really good book. And he talked about one of his leadership lessons was, once you stayed for quite some time, you better be really aware that you now have this sort of overbearing presence and people will just not give you that dissent as often as maybe they would have when you were new.
I agree. And I would add to that, the higher you go up in an organization, it's really hard to get honest feedback and it's hard to get that dissent as well, where if you are the boss, even if you haven't been there for a while, still difficult. I hear that from leaders all the time that they need that honest feedback. They want to hear dissenting opinions, but it's very hard to come by.
Yeah, no question.
Another factor that you note in the book that is a contributing factor to not making great decisions is that deeper explanation, right? That leaders fail to make and implement decisions successfully for a more fundamental reason, that they tend to first focus and foremost on the right solution when a problem arises, rather than, and I think this is so brilliant, rather than stepping back to determine the right process that should be employed to make that decision. I think that's a subtle distinction here, but a really relevant and important one.
Yeah, I call this deciding how to decide, right? That leaders would serve themselves well and their teams well and their organizations well if they step back and say, wait, how should we go about making this choice? But we dig in and try to solve the problem. The problem with trying to just go in and solve the problem is that, first of all, the leader often is pretty far removed from the customer, from the supplier, from the factory floor. And so they don't have all the information necessary to make that decision. They may think they do, right? But they often don't. And so diving in too quickly leads you astray. So stepping back and saying, wait, how should I go about doing this? And thinking carefully about, okay, what kind of information am I going to need? Who do I want to get that information from? How will I bring the team together? Right? These are really key questions to ask yourself. And if you do that up front, it does not take very long, right? And you've sort of got for yourself a little toolkit of, okay, these are some techniques I'm going to apply. This is kind of the format by which I want to perhaps bring people together. It can be helpful. And we don't do it the same way, right? What works for you, Charles, and your leadership style and your culture might be different than mine. That's okay. But we all need to sort of decide how to decide for ourselves rather than just going in and just jumping down the rabbit hole too quickly.
That is great. I love that. And that's going to be very valuable to all of our listeners, I know. And so right now, I'd love to go work through a historical example that I've heard you state many times in your programs to give our leaders, our listeners listening, just some insights, leadership lessons from how a decision was made initially by JFK, the Bay of Pigs fiasco invasion, and how the decision-making process was improved by what he learned when he encountered the Cuban Missile Crisis. So if you could first give us a little bit of historical context, background on those, and then I'd love to kind of dive in to certain characteristics of each one and compare and contrast them to give our leaders that insight that this story is packed with leadership lessons on great decision-making or poor decision-making, depending on which event we're looking at. So,
yeah, I mean, I had good fortune and not just, as many people have read through the history books and read the firsthand accounts and tried to analyze these two case studies, if you will. But I also had the opportunity in 2005 to spend a good chunk of a day with Robert McNamara, who was Kennedy's Secretary of Defense and who was involved in both decisions, and talk to him about how things transpired in both cases. And the Bay of Pigs is a fascinating story, of course, made famous, those of us who study management and leadership, by the fact that Irving Janis wrote his famous book, Victims of Groupthink. And the opening chapter is his incredible analysis of what he called the Bay of Pigs fiasco, right? This decision by John F. Kennedy in the first 3 months of his administration to support and equip and train a group of Cuban exiles to try to go in and essentially launch an insurgency and overthrow Castro. And of course, it completely failed. Several thousand Cuban exiles captured or killed on the beaches of Cuba. And the world soon finds out the US was behind it. The CIA was behind it. And so Kennedy is embarrassed. He apologizes to the country, but also it leads to all kinds of other big geopolitical problems for him early. It's a classic case of groupthink. McNamara said, Kennedy went around the room and said, do you agree or not? And the CIA was strongly advocating for this. It was a plan they'd been working on for years. It predated Kennedy coming to Washington. And McNamara said, there was great pressure to support it. He goes, I don't think Dean Rusk or I supported it. Well, we're enthusiastic, but we didn't say, no, don't do it. Right. And so it's a classic case of groupthink. Everyone's thinking, I must be the only one with doubts. In fact, there were a number of people with doubts, but there was a powerful advocate pushing ahead. So what happened afterward, what I learned is fascinating, is that John Kennedy did his own little kind of post-mortem. He did something we can't even really imagine today. He called his predecessor, who was of the opposing political party. He called Dwight Eisenhower to Washington and said, would you come basically talk to me about this terrible decision I made? And he did. And then Kennedy talked to his advisors too. And he ends up coming up with some ideas, some sort of process improvements, if you will, in the language of today, for how they would gather and work through a really tough issue in the future. And a year later, they had the missile crisis emerge, where the Soviets were working with the Castro regime to install nuclear missile bases on the island of Cuba. And they apply a series of those techniques because they are struggling with a monumental decision, the world, on the brink of essentially nuclear war. And they apply some of these techniques, these process improvements. They have a much different discussion. They have alternatives. They have vigorous debate. They've got devil's advocates. They just have a totally different process that transpires. And they really vet two principal alternatives incredibly closely and scrutinize them. And ultimately, they decide in favor of this naval blockade. And the blockade, coupled with diplomatic moves, leads to a peaceful resolution of the crisis. So it's a tremendous example of learning from failure, but it's a tremendous example of deciding how to decide, saying with some forethought, a year before the missile crisis, we're going to put in place some mechanisms to make sure groupthink does not happen to us again.
That's great. Let's unpack a little bit of some of that compare and contrast. So I'll state here's what Kennedy did during the Bay of Pigs, and then maybe you can contrast that with what he did in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So the role of the president in the Bay of Pigs, he was present at all the meetings. How did that change in the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah, he steps out of the room. This incredible decision he makes to give the team a chance for a number of days to spend a bulk of the time on their own without him in the room. And, McNamara said to me, that's the way to get your people to be frank. They're not worried about what will the boss think of my idea when it's maybe not like fully baked, it's just a tentative thought. So, I'm afraid what's he going to think of it, to work out loud my thinking and issues without that worry, and they can get better with the help of my colleagues. Right. And so big one, a really big one.
What a courageous act by Kennedy during that time. How about for group norms? So group norms during the Bay of Pigs, they deferred to the experts, right? They adhered very strictly to rules and protocols. So
yeah, they decided that, they were going to sort of suspend the rules of protocol, try to create an atmosphere of more equal rank. They did some things like they moved on to the White House for a lot of the meetings, which I think really helped to kind of level the playing field within the room. And then they had some people in there explicitly who were not at all experts on foreign policy, but they wanted some of these sort of unbiased non-experts, to be able to, who weren't sort of beholden to the conventional wisdom of foreign policy at the time, who were not, caught up with the latest assumptions around the Soviets and around the Cuban regime, but who could just think about it with some fresh perspective. So the norms are different. And I think they were a big part of the story. I think really good leaders are nowadays, you see more and more of them getting more explicit about what should our norms be, right? And even articulating those out loud or in writing to the team.
They also had very different views, these two events, on the participation and involvement. Whereas with the Bay of Pigs, everything was very secret. Low-level people were not invited, not encouraged to share any points of view. They felt maybe they weren't qualified. But that was contrasted with what occurred during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Kennedy learned, and one of the things that came out in his discussion with Eisenhower, was the notion that, look, I mean, information gets filtered. You got these junior people who have a lot of expertise, but if you're just waiting for that to get passed up the hierarchy in the form of memos at the time, right? By the time it gets to you, it's like that game of operator when you were a kid. The message gets really garbled. And so you got to get around that. You got to get direct access to people who have knowledge and make sure you're hearing that with your own ears coming directly from their lip. That's a really key thing that they started to change that really helped them, I think, in the missile crisis.
Two more pieces of that I'd like to just unpack for our listeners. One is the alternatives, right? Bay of Pigs, rapid convergence upon a single alternative, no competing plans presented to the president. So he didn't really hear any dissenting or diverse viewpoints.
A couple of things there. One is Kennedy explicitly asked for alternatives in the missile crisis. So when he sent the group off, he wanted to hear options. He didn't want to get presented with just a fait accompli. He wanted options. So he made that clear. The other is that he had these two people playing the role of devil's advocate, Bobby Kennedy and Ted Sorensen, who was another longtime confidant, a trusted confidant of the president. And, I think they did a really nice job of sort of saying to the group, when initially there really was only one option on the table, it was actually a military airstrike was the initial option, was to say, look, let's come up with them other options, even if they might sound, crazy or infeasible, or if you think, well, then that'll never solve the problem, but let's just get them out there. And one of the remarkable things is the blockade was something that actually had been talked about some months prior, but until the devil's advocates sort of gave people license to put that on the table, it maybe wouldn't have emerged, because they were starting to, okay, airstrikes are option. We got to do that, And so that second option, and they discussed some others too. As I said, there were some diplomatic elements too, but things I think really broke for the better once they got a second major option on the table.
That's a great point that during the Bay of Pigs, there was no individual that was designated with the devil's advocate role. There was no dissenting points of view that were occupied. But in the Cuban Missile Crisis there was, which really helped to build out just a better decision-making process overall. And throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, we see kind of those two variants of longstanding, very effective procedures of fostering divergent thinking and vigorous debate, which is really crucial, right, for any good decision-making in an organization or elsewhere.
Yeah, I mentioned those advocates, but the other thing they do is they do this subgroup technique. There's this point where once they've got these two primary options, they actually break into two subgroups. Each subgroup takes an option. They write up their plan in great detail, and then they swap essentially white papers. And Bobby Kennedy wrote in his book about this, that they dissected and critiqued each other's plans and then returned them to the original subgroup for them to develop further answers. What a hell of a technique.
Great insight from that great example from history. As we near the end of our episode, I always like to leave our listeners with some insights, things they can do right away. I'd love for this episode to end on maybe, Mike, pick one thing that at an individual level to improve your decision-making. Maybe it's overcoming a certain bias. What can a leader do? And then maybe at a group or team dynamic level, what's one insight, tool, technique that you can share that's going to help them on that level as well?
So one of the ones at the individual level, we talk about one of the traps that we all fall into, or cognitive biases, is confirmation bias, right? That we tend to focus on data that confirms what we already believe, right? Or what we really want to believe. And we can turn a blind eye, or we can just, have the blinders on such that we're not seeing the information that might actually contradict our worldview. And so I talk about a strategy that purportedly Charles Darwin used long before the whole term confirmation bias was even coined, whereas he's said to have kept two notebooks when he went out into the field to conduct his observations. One notebook, he recorded evidence that supported his emerging hypotheses. And in the second notebook, he forced himself to record things that were not consistent with his existing or emerging hypotheses. So the second notebook strategy as a manager, I think, can be really effective to say, are you just marshaling evidence to persuade people that you're right? Or are you actually looking for evidence to figure out what is right? Those are very different things, right? So that's one. At the group level, lots of things we can do. But I think that one of the things that can be really helpful for a group to do is to take the time if they've got a really crucial decision and to literally write down what their assumptions are as a group. What assumptions are we making? And are they valid? Do we have evidence? Is there any way to test those assumptions? That can be a great way to create dialogue, because now you're not arguing over, do you want Mike's plan or Charles's plan? So that can get contentious. But if we write the assumptions down and say, which assumptions are correct, that sometimes is less, right? People are not as defensive because you're not attacking my plan or your plan, my option or yours. But once you clarify what assumptions, right, look to be valid, that often clarifies the thinking around then what direction you should take, right? So it can be a less threatening way to have a really start debate within a team, as opposed to starting with, let's debate the options. That can be contentious often.
I love that. And thank you for sharing all these insights with me today and for our listeners. I know they're going to have great value in those. Before we end today, let our listeners know, Mike, how they can get a hold of you.
Sure. I mean, best thing is probably a website, www.professormichaelroberto.com. And you can contact me through the website. You can read about some of my work there. There's a link to my blog, which I blog about current research in leadership, as well as about my take on some of the interesting leadership lessons from some of the things in the headlines these days. So that's probably the best way to get a hold of me and learn more about my research.
Thank you, Mike, for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Charles.
This concludes this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. You can send us your feedback at info@ims-online.com. If you'd like to subscribe, this podcast can be found both on Apple and Spotify and can also be accessed on the Institute for Management Studies website at ims-online.com. And until next time, remember, it's not what you know, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.